December 29th, 1944. 23:40 hours. Mindoro Island, the Philippines. The tropical sky above McGuire Field was the color of burnt coal, seamless and absolute in its darkness. No moon, no stars visible through the dense Pacific overcast. The kind of night that swallowed shapes whole, that turned the outline of a man at 50 paces into nothing at all. The airstrip below smelled of red clay, aviation fuel, and the iron residue of recent rain. Somewhere out in the black water surrounding the island, Japanese ships were trying to reach their dying garrisons with the last of their supplies. Somewhere above the clouds, engines droned, engines that did not belong to anyone on the American side. Inside the cramped cockpit of a large twin-engine aircraft painted in deep, glossy black, Major Carroll C. Smith sat with his gloved hands resting lightly on the controls and watched a small circular screen mounted in front of him. On that screen, a pale green light swept in slow, methodical arcs, outward, 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 searching the darkness the way a lighthouse searches a coastline. The screen was the size of a dinner plate. It was connected to a 415-pound device locked inside the aircraft's elongated nose. It was connected, in turn, to the most consequential technology of the Second World War. And tonight, it was going to show Major Smith things the human eye could never see, things the Japanese believed no American eye could ever see. The fighter director's voice crackled through Smith's headset. A contact southwest 8,000 feet, 12 to 15 miles out. Approaching. The screen confirmed it. And a pale blip moved across the green arc. Major Smith banked his aircraft gently into the darkness and set a collision course. He did not reach for a searchlight. He did not call for flares. He simply flew toward the blip, guided by a logic that was invisible, mathematical, and utterly lethal. The aircraft around him was 66 feet wide from wingtip to wingtip. It was armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannons mounted beneath its belly. Its paint was so specifically formulated, not flat black but glossy black, that tests conducted in Florida in the autumn of 1943 had shown it to be undetectable through searchlight beams in 80% of flights. It carried no tracer rounds. It announced nothing of itself. It was, in every operational and philosophical sense of the term, a creature of pure, controlled American darkness. Yet the Japanese pilot approaching Mindoro that night believed, with every measure of his training and doctrine, that he was untouchable. He was wrong. To understand why a Japanese pilot flying in total darkness in December of 1944 could be so profoundly mistaken about the security of his own sky, one must travel back not merely in time, but in philosophy. The Imperial Japanese military had, from the earliest days of the Pacific War, organized an entire strategic chapter of its operations around the premise that darkness was a sanctuary, that the night sky was a domain that belonged by nature to patience, to stealth, to those willing to fly when others slept. Japanese military doctrine treated nighttime operations not as a concession to caution, but as a deliberate expression of offensive spirit. As the Japanese Navy drilled its surface warships in night torpedo tactics with a ferocity that bordered on religious. Japanese ground forces used the darkness as a weapon of infiltration and psychological terror. And Japanese aviation units, particularly the long-range bomber crews flying from bases at Rabaul, from the island chains of the Solomons, from forward fields pressed ever southward toward the Allied-held positions at Guadalcanal and beyond, treated the night sky as their personal highway, largely free of interference, a canvas across which they could paint havoc at will. The Mitsubishi G-4M bomber, which Allied code names would dub the Betty, was the embodiment of this doctrine. It was a long, elegant aircraft with an extraordinary range, over 3,700 miles when fully loaded, capable of covering enormous stretches of Pacific water and returning before dawn. The Betty had opened the Pacific War with attacks on the Philippines and the sinking of 2 British capital ships off the coast of Malaya in December 1941. By 1942, it had become Japan's primary instrument of night harassment. Crews flying out of Rabaul would cruise at altitude over Allied positions on Guadalcanal, dropping a bomb here, dropping a flare there, making the wretched, malaria-haunted Marines below dive into foxholes for hours on end. American soldiers gave this particular aircraft a name that captured the quality of its presence perfectly. They called it Washing Machine Charlie, because the G4M's engines, when not perfectly synchronized, produced a rhythmic and throbbing drone that sounded at altitude in the dark, exactly like an old laundry machine turning over and over in the dead of night. It was not a sound you could sleep through. It was not a sound you could easily forget. By November 1942, Admiral William Bull Halsey had personally experienced the effect of Japanese night bombing. Newly arrived at Guadalcanal to assess conditions there, he watched men who had fought for months against starvation, malaria, and relentless attacks. He saw their hollow faces and their gaunt bodies. And then, after dark, he heard those engines. In his post-war memoir, Halsey was characteristically blunt about his own reaction. He tried, he wrote, to order himself to sleep, telling himself he was a damned coward for flinching at the sound, but the orders did not work. Nobody slept when Washing Machine Charlie was overhead. That was, precisely and deliberately, the point. Halsey requested 6 radar-equipped night fighters be sent to Guadalcanal at once. The response he received from Marine Corps headquarters in Washington was an admission of a kind that rarely travels well through military channels. The United States Marine Corps, 1 full year into the Pacific War, did not possess a single operational night fighter aircraft with airborne intercept radar. Marine historians would record the state of American night fighting in 1942 with stark simplicity. In the beginning, they wrote, there were no planes, no pilots, no American precedents, very little recognition of the need for night fighters, and extremely primitive equipment for locating enemy planes. That sentence is a window into a moment of profound strategic imbalance. While Japanese bomber crews were flying over Allied positions with near impunity in the darkness, American engineers and aviators were scrambling from essentially nothing to close a gap that threatened to bleed Allied forces 1 sleepless, terrified night at a time. And yet that scramble had already begun somewhere else, somewhere far from the Pacific, in a building at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, where some of the most consequential scientific work of the 20th century was being conducted under strict wartime secrecy. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, established in 1940 after British scientists shared the secrets of the cavity magnetron, a device that generated microwave radar waves of remarkable precision and compact dimension, had become America's primary engine for radar development. The laboratory would ultimately design nearly half of all radar systems deployed by the Allied nations during the entire war. It employed over 4,000 people at its peak, physicists and engineers drawn from universities across the country, men and women working around the clock inside a democracy's most powerful instrument of technological leverage, the combination of a free press that permitted public scientific education, a university system that nurtured specialization, and an industrial base that could translate discovery into mass production faster than any other nation on Earth. Yet from the radiation laboratory came the SCR-720, a compact, sophisticated microwave-band airborne intercept radar, specifically engineered to be mounted inside an aircraft nose housed around a rotating parabolic dish antenna small enough, just barely, to fit inside the redesigned nose cone of a purpose-built night fighter. The SCR-720 weighed 415 pounds, not including cables. It could sweep the sky ahead of an aircraft in a 180-degree arc. Under good conditions, it could detect an aircraft at a range of approximately 16 miles. At operationally realistic combat altitudes, it reliably acquired a target at 8,000 to 8,500 yards, roughly 5 miles, giving a crew several minutes to close and maneuver into a firing position before a target was ever aware it had been found. And for the pilot and radar operator seated in the aircraft, the SCR-720 spoke through a glowing green circular display, its sweep arm painting pale ghost images of everything that moved in the sky ahead. That green glow, steady, rotating, unhurried, was the heartbeat of a new kind of warfare. It was not the flicker of a searchlight, desperate and obvious and easily avoided. It was not the limited geometry of a human eye straining against Pacific blackness. It was something else entirely. It was mathematics made visible. It was the product of free societies that funded universities, that trained engineers, that built factories capable of producing dozens of these devices each week and shipping them across 2 oceans simultaneously. Every time that green sweep arm passed across the radar screen, yet it was carrying with it a piece of everything that American industrial democracy had chosen to invest in the invisible infrastructure of war. The Japanese had radar. Let that fact be stated plainly, because the war is not well served by caricature. Japanese scientists were not ignorant. Japan had developed its own radar systems, had recognized the technology's potential, had begun installing ground-based and shipboard sets in the years before 1941. But there were differences that would prove decisive when measured against what American engineers had built. Japanese radar development was fragmented, under-resourced relative to the scale of American investment, and significantly behind in the critical area of microwave technology, Japanese airborne intercept radar, an equivalent to what the Americans were building into the noses of their night fighters, was not available in operational form. Japanese bomber crews flying at night in 1943 and 1944 had no equivalent of the SCR-720 on their side of the equation. They could not see what was behind them. They could not detect what was closing on them from below and to the rear, at 5 miles, at 4 miles, at 3 miles, with engines throttled back to muffle the sound and glossy black paint absorbing the weak backscatter of searchlights. The aircraft designed to carry the SCR-720 into combat was itself a statement about what a nation unburdened by geographic invasion and armed with extraordinary industrial capacity could build when it organized its will around a problem. The Northrop P-51 Black Widow had been conceived in October 1940. When the Army Air Corps asked Jack Northrop, a California aircraft designer already doing work for the British, to create a purpose-built night fighter around the new centimeter-wave radar, Northrop had the initial proposal on military desks in Dayton, Ohio, within 1 week of receiving the request. A contract for prototype development followed in January 1941. The XP-61 made its first flight in May 1942. From concept to flying prototype in under 18 months, by a company small enough that its entire design team could fit comfortably in a single California building. The P-61 that emerged from that process was unlike anything else flying in the American arsenal. It was enormous for a fighter, 66 feet from wingtip to wingtip, nearly the span of some medium bombers. And its fuselage was slung between 2 long tail booms that each housed a supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, giving the aircraft a top speed of 366 miles per hour and, more critically for its mission, stable and docile handling qualities that allowed crews to fly long patrols at altitude without exhausting themselves. Behind the pilot, in his own elevated cockpit with a clear forward view, sat the radar operator. His scope was rimmed with dark fur to eliminate stray light. The cockpit instruments glowed red, preserving night vision. The pilot had a second, smaller scope up front so that both men could see the same picture of the sky ahead. The four 20mm cannons were mounted in a belly pod beneath the fuselage, where their muzzle flash would be least likely to destroy the crew's night vision. No tracer rounds, no searchlights, no flares. The P-51 hunted in complete, deliberate silence, guided by that pale green sweep on its radar screen. Its paint told its own story. British combat experience had revealed that flat black paint, counterintuitively, produced a faint white silhouette when caught in searchlights. Flight tests in Florida in the autumn of 1943 pitted three different paint schemes against each other in actual searchlight beams. Glossy black, precisely the right combination of reflectivity and absorption, was undetected in 80% of test passes through the beams. The P-61 went to war in glossy black. Northrop built 674 of them. American factories managed to deliver this number of highly complex, radar-equipped and twin-engine purpose-built night fighters in a single year of peak production, while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of other combat aircraft across a manufacturing base that would, by the end of the conflict, deliver more than 300,000 military aircraft total to the Allied cause. The first P-61s did not reach the Pacific until the late spring of 1944. Before they arrived, American night fighter units had been doing what they could with aircraft that were never designed for the mission. The Douglas P-70, essentially a light bomber stripped of its bombs, fitted with a primitive SCR-520 radar, and hurriedly declared a night fighter, was slow, lacked the supercharged engines necessary for high-altitude pursuit, and performed poorly against the aircraft it was hunting. Marine and Army squadrons flew P-70S, modified Lockheed Venturas, radar-equipped Corsairs, and whatever else could be made to carry a radar set and a gun into the Pacific night. They did their best work through sheer determination, flying aircraft their own commanders privately described as entirely unsatisfactory. And still, in the mountains of paperwork and the terse combat reports filed by exhausted crews after nights over Bougainville and the Solomons, something was being built that went beyond equipment. A doctrine was forming. A vocabulary of night interception was being written in experience. The Marine Corps' 5MF, NN 531, the Gray Ghosts, had been activated on November 16, 1942, at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, North Carolina. They built their squadron from nothing, quite literally from 3 packing crates that served as desk and chairs in an unheated shed. As their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Schwabel, had spent months in England studying how the Royal Air Force integrated ground control intercept stations with airborne radar to vector night fighters onto their targets. He returned with notes, with understanding, and with a quiet certainty that this was the future of air warfare after dark. When the Gray Ghosts reached the Solomon Islands in 1943 with their makeshift Lockheed PV-1 Venturas, modified and stripped of de-icing equipment to shave weight and improve altitude performance, they were still flying aircraft that Schwabel himself described in official reports as a makeshift night fighter, entirely unsatisfactory, and yet. On the 14th of November, 1943, a Ventura named Coral Princess was guided by destroyer-based fighter directors onto a G-4M Betty bomber operating from the massive Japanese base at Rabaul. The radar operator, Technical Sergeant Charles Stout, acquired the target at 6,000 feet range. The pilot and gunner closed and opened fire. The Betty fell in flames. It was one more kill in a slowly accumulating American ledger of night interception, a ledger that was still modest in number but enormous in what it portended, because every American victory in the night sky over the Solomons was a message that the Japanese, in the certainty of their doctrine, were not yet hearing clearly. The Gray Ghosts flew over 100 night missions from the Solomons. They scored 12 confirmed aerial victories. They did it with an aircraft that was undersized, underpowered, and temperamentally unreliable. They did it through training, through the meticulous coordination of ground controllers and airborne crews. through the slow accumulation of hard-won knowledge about what night interception required. When the P-51 finally arrived in the Pacific to replace them, the institutional knowledge the Gray Ghosts and units like them had built formed the doctrinal foundation on which the new technology could perform to its full capacity. Then, in the summer of 1944, the Black Widow came to the Pacific, and everything changed. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron had been fighting since Guadalcanal. By June of 1944, it was stationed on Saipan in the Marianas, and it had just completed the transition from its P-70S to brand-new P-61s. On the night of June 30th, 1944, pilot Lieutenant Dale Haberman and radar operator Lieutenant Raymond Mooney took a Black Widow into the sky over Saipan. Their radar scope, that same slow green sweep, picked up a contact. They set course, they closed, they maneuvered, and at an appropriate range, without searchlights, without tracer rounds, without any visual announcement of their presence, they destroyed a Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber. It was the first kill ever recorded by a P-61 in the Pacific Theater. The Betty's crew had been flying a night mission, in total darkness over ocean water, in the same way Japanese bomber crews had been flying since 1942, in the confident belief that night was their shield. It was not their shield anymore. Through the second half of 1944, as American forces island-hopped northward and westward toward the Philippines, the P-61 squadrons expanded their operations. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron operated across the Southwest Pacific. The 421st worked against Japanese shipping convoys at night, using the radar not only to find aircraft but to detect vessels on the surface, vectoring daytime aircraft onto targets identified through the darkness. General George Kenney, commanding Allied air forces under General Douglas MacArthur, wrote in his memoirs about ordering P-61s to harass a Japanese convoy at Ormoc through the entire night, keeping the ships at sea unable to unload until daybreak brought conventional attack aircraft to finish the job. The night fighters also downed 7 Japanese aircraft attempting to cover the convoy. Kenney did not write about luck. He wrote about methodology. The P-61 had given American commanders a tool that extended the operational clock of the war to 24 hours, and they were using it with increasing precision. Japanese pilots received no warning that this shift was happening. The doctrinal premise under which they operated, that the night sky was sanctuary, that darkness was absolute protection, that an aircraft flying at altitude over black ocean water in total cloud cover was essentially invisible, had not been publicly revised. There was no directive that reached forward combat units saying that the Americans had built something that could find you in the dark. The Betty crews who took off from airfields at night in late 1944 were in many cases flying with fewer flight hours than their predecessors. That's because by that point, Japan's aviation training pipeline had been severely degraded by the loss of its veteran pilots, consumed over Midway, over the Coral Sea, over the Marianas, over the Solomons, and by fuel shortages so severe that student pilots were being certified with a fraction of the flight experience that had produced Japan's pre-war elite. These crews were brave. They were committed. They were flying through darkness on the strength of a doctrine that told them darkness was enough. It was not enough. Consider what a Japanese bomber crew experienced on a night intercept after the summer of 1944. They are at altitude, at cruise power, following a heading toward an American target, an airstrip, an anchorage, a supply depot. They see nothing around them. There is no moon. Just there is ocean below and cloud above and darkness in every direction. There is no radar warning receiver on their aircraft, no device that might detect the emissions of an approaching SSER 720 and alert them that something is painting them from miles away. There is no airborne intercept radar of their own to scan the sky behind them. Their rear gunner is watching the dark, watching hard, and seeing nothing. Because there is nothing to see. Because the aircraft approaching them from the rear quarter, below and astern, at roughly 350 miles per hour with engines at reduced power, is painted glossy black, is firing no tracers, has no running lights, and has been guided to within firing range entirely by a green sweep on a screen that the crew of the Betty will never see and never know about until the 20mm shells begin arriving. There was no sound of warning. There was no visual cue. There was only, in an instant, the impact of cannon fire that seemed to come from nowhere, from the darkness itself, and then the fuel tanks of the Mitsubishi G4M, notorious among Allied pilots as a flying Zippo for their catastrophic tendency to ignite upon receiving hits, would catch, and the sky would turn orange, and the night that had been so absolute and so protecting would become a furnace. Some crews survived. Some were recovered from the water by Japanese vessels and returned to their bases. And those survivors carried back a report that their commands found deeply uncomfortable, and a report about darkness that was not dark anymore, about a sky that could see when no eye should have been able to see, about a hunter that found them in conditions where finding should have been impossible. The reports did not change Japanese bombing doctrine immediately. Doctrine is resistant to individual testimony, particularly testimony that requires admitting a fundamental vulnerability that there is no available counter for. But the reports accumulated, and across the last year of the war, the behavior of Japanese night bombing units shifted in ways that historical analysis captures clearly. Missions decreased. Altitudes changed. The willingness to press attacks over heavily defended areas at night, which had once been routine, almost casual in its confidence, began to give way to hesitation, to aborted missions, and to the unsettling recognition among Japanese air commanders that the night sky over American-held territory had become a place where their aircraft died in ways that their pilots could not see coming and their doctrine could not explain. Major Carroll Smith's night of December 29th into December 30th, 1944, stands as the clearest single illustration of how completely the equation had been inverted. At 23:40 hours, Smith and his radar operator, Lieutenant Philip Porter, were airborne over Mindoro. The fighter director's first contact came in from the southwest. Smith flew the collision course, watched the blip resolve on the scope, and closed. After a 7-minute pursuit in and out of cloud, he brought the P-51's cannons to bear on a Japanese Irving, a large twin-engine escort fighter, and destroyed it with a burst of fire. And he returned to convoy patrol. Within minutes, a second Irving appeared on the scope. Another burst, another fireball, another aircraft destroyed before its crew ever knew they were being tracked. Smith landed to refuel. He took off again. A third contact, a slow-moving roof float plane barely 200 feet above the water, picking its way through the darkness. The pursuit was comical and grimly efficient. Smith said afterward that chasing the float plane was like trying to catch a greased pig in a barrel. He caught it. He landed again. He took off again. A fourth contact resolved on the scope, a Japanese medium bomber with a top speed of 400 miles per hour, faster than anything Smith should have been comfortable engaging head-on. He closed to 75 feet before firing. At 75 feet, the kill was assured regardless of the ammunition count. The fourth Japanese aircraft of the night fell into the Philippine darkness. 4 kills, 1 crew, 80 minutes of operational flying. In the after-action assessment of that night, the official history of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron recorded that Smith and Porter's achievement, combined with their previous victories, had made Smith the United States Army Air Force's leading night fighter ace of the entire war, with 7 confirmed kills. What the record books cannot fully quantify is the quality of bewilderment on the other side of those encounters. Japanese airmen flying night missions over Mindoro in December 1944 were not flying into a fair contest between opposing technologies. They were flying, effectively, blind, against an adversary who could see them from 5 miles away, close to within firing range in total silence, and destroy them before they had registered so much as a silhouette against the dark sky. It was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was an ambush conducted by physics. The technology that made it possible, the SCR-720 radar, that pale green sweep on its circular display, had been born in a Cambridge laboratory where scientists whose names the Japanese High Command had never read worked freely, published openly before the war, and then, when the war came, turned the entire weight of American scientific culture toward the problem of winning it. The MIT Radiation Laboratory alone designed nearly half of all radar systems deployed by the Allies in the entire war. It created over 100 different radar systems, and it drew its personnel from universities that had been building scientific capability for generations, funded by a society that treated the education of its citizens not as a military project, but as a basic investment in the future. The SCR-720 that Major Carroll Smith and his radar operator used to destroy 4 Japanese aircraft in 80 minutes over a Philippine island on the last night of December 1944 was, in a very literal sense, the product of everything democratic society had quietly accumulated in the decades before the war: education, freedom of inquiry, industrial organization, the ability to take a scientific discovery made by 2 British physicists and turn it within a few years into hundreds of deployed operational systems painted into the nose cones of purpose-built night fighters flying combat missions across the Pacific. Japan was not incapable of scientific achievement. Japan produced fine engineers and skilled military theorists, but the structure of its military-industrial complex, the concentration of research authority within a rigid hierarchy that restricted information flow and limited independent inquiry, the relative underfunding of the programs that would have produced an equivalent airborne microwave radar. These were not accidents of geography or fate. They were the downstream consequences of the choices a society makes about how it values knowledge, how freely it allows ideas to travel between institutions, and how generously it funds the people who generate new understanding without immediately knowing what it will be used for. That green sweep on the SCR-720 screen, rotating once every fraction of a second, painting the position of every aircraft within 5 to 16 miles in all forward directions, that green sweep was freedom's eye. It was what a society looked like when it decided to invest in the things it could not yet see. By the end of the Pacific War, American night fighter units had logged 127 confirmed aerial kills, a number modest by the scale of the air war's total accounting, but carrying disproportionate strategic weight because of when and where it was delivered. The Betty bomber crews who had once circled over Guadalcanal unopposed, dropping their nuisance bombs and grinding the sleep from American Marines below, were by the final year of the war operating with a caution that bordered on paralysis. Japanese air commanders reviewing the post-war record and acknowledged that the loss of experienced crews to night fighter interception had contributed meaningfully to the broader collapse of Japan's offensive air capability. The American night fighters had not won the Pacific War. No single weapon system wins a war, but they had systematically dismantled one of Japan's most psychologically valuable operational assets, the freedom of the night sky, and replaced it with something the Japanese military mind had not adequately prepared to confront, an enemy that never needed to see them at all. There is a particular kind of shock that belongs not to the moment of impact, but to the moment of comprehension. A Japanese pilot who survived a night encounter with a P-51 did not come away having merely lost a battle. He came away having lost a belief, the belief that darkness was sanctuary, and that the night sky was territory that could be held and owned by will and training alone. The intelligence that the Americans possessed, a machine that could find and destroy an aircraft in total, absolute, cloud-covered darkness, was not a comfortable piece of information to carry, because it implied something that extended far beyond any specific tactical encounter. It implied that the contest was not only being fought with different weapons, It was being fought with a different relationship to the physical world itself. American technology had effectively abolished one of the most fundamental features of the natural environment as a military asset. They had taken darkness, which is simply the absence of light, which is physics, which is nature, and rendered it irrelevant. And the P-51 Black Widow was retired from combat at the end of the war. The last operational Black Widow left Japan in May 1950, headed for the Boneyard. Northrop Aircraft, the small California company that had built them, the company that Jack Northrop had assembled from a handful of engineers and a commitment to clean sheet design, would eventually become Northrop Grumman, one of the largest defense corporations in the world. The MIT Radiation Laboratory that designed the SCIR-720 was formally closed on December 31, 1945, and its scientists returned to universities, to medical research, to physics and engineering departments that would spend the next decades reshaping the civilized world with the same methods and the same spirit they had used to reshape the dark skies over the Pacific. 3 P-61 Black Widows survive. One is at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy Center. One is at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. A third was recovered, piece by piece across multiple expeditions in the 1980s, from the 45-degree slope of a New Guinea mountainside where it had crash-landed in 1944 and sat for 40 years. It was restored to flight condition and placed on display in Reading, Pennsylvania. That particular aircraft had spent 5 days with its squadron before its crash. It contributed nothing to the kill count, and yet someone valued it enough to climb a tropical mountain and carry it home, fragment by fragment, because what it represented was worth that kind of effort. What it represented was the idea that the darkness is not the enemy's property, that the night does not belong by default, and to those willing to fly in it, that a free society, given sufficient time and sufficient faith in the tools of knowledge, the university, the laboratory, the factory floor, the trained crew working together in a 2-seat cockpit with a glowing green screen between them, can illuminate any darkness, can see through any night, can reach into the most absolute blackness and touch what hides there. On the morning of December 30th, 1944, the pale Pacific dawn rose over Mindoro Island and found the airstrip quiet. Major Carroll Smith's P-61 sat on the field, its glossy black paint catching the earliest gray light, its radar nose pointed toward a sky that was now, unambiguously, friendly. Somewhere in the water around the island, in the debris of 4 burning aircraft, Japanese air commanders were processing reports that did not make sense within the framework of their doctrine, reports about darkness that was not dark, about silence that was not silent, about an enemy that hunted by a light they had never been told existed. They would keep receiving those reports. They would keep struggling to fit them into a doctrine that had no category for what was happening, and in the end, they would run out of time to build one. The green sweep on the radar scope does not forgive. It does not blink. It does not need the sun to rise before it does its work. It simply rotates and rotates and rotates, patient as a heartbeat, relentless as a tide, painting the dark sky in the language of the free world, and waiting to find whatever comes within its reach.